All right, so this is the next installment of the Dev Book Club. We're covering factories tonight, which is chapter 11 of the Implementing Domain-Driven Design book by Vaughn Vernon. I don't know. I thought this chapter was actually, for being as short as it was, it had some pretty interesting insight. I think that just thinking about the word factory, like you immediately think, oh, this is going to be a boring foray into what is the Gang of Four factory patterns, and you're like, what do they look like? And but he kind of cut all that out and said, if you're interested in that kind of material, go and find that in the Gang of Four book, or go and find it online, or go read the Blue Book, and it talks about some of this stuff. So I thought that was a pretty cool thing of him to do for this particular chapter, anyway.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any? Do you have any opening thoughts? I guess, Jeremy, I know you have something. We haven't seen you in a while, so welcome back.
I think you've been up storing up these thoughts for I've really in there. Yeah, the thing I really liked about it, and I'm just looking at the beginning of the chapter again, and the first thing I highlighted was a factory may or may not have additional responsibilities in the domain model other than object creation. And I think that was one of the key things in the chapter for me, is that we think about factories as just being creating an object, but he's talking about how it can have responsibilities to help you model in ubiquitous language, to express concepts within your domain, and to enforce those rules of those concepts as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that was a cool thing. Like you're saying, like when you typically think of a factory, you're thinking solely, oh yeah, just taking these dependencies and wiring them together and just make it easier to do. But then, most of his examples, he even had, uh, the factory actually triggering an event or that sort of thing. And it's like, yeah, it can actually do something that's useful within the domain, not just, hey, let me create a new person for you. Let me actually say this happened. I think that was, I agree. I think that was kind of a cool and very useful tip to just think outside the box, I guess. Yeah, it kind of along those lines. I did also really appreciate uh, the time that he spent on talking about how the factories themselves, like how the methods and how they're supposed to actually express concepts in the domain rather than just be create user or that sort of thing, which you typically see in a factory. It's called a user factory, and it has a build method or something like that, or a create method, or whatever people call it. And you're like, well, that doesn't really tell me anything. And then here it's saying you can actually take concepts from your domain and turn them into the factory methods and into the actual factories that exist, and they're named something that makes sense for your domain based on what your experts are telling you.
The other one I really liked as well was the idea that, so we tend to think about, or I tend to think, I should say, of factory objects as being small, discrete objects or static methods that then generate something else. But I liked how he talks about factory methods or things like aggregates that can then perform some sort of operation on that object as well. And I found that quite illuminating. I hadn't really considered that very much before.
Yeah, I think the first time reading this and seeing, well, I guess, I had the preconception that it was going to be solely about what you're talking about, like I've got this factory object or factory class basically, and it's got these static methods, and I just call them, and then I get objects back. But yeah, like you're saying, like, considering a factory method to be a domain factory, I think is kind of cool in an aggregate. I think that's a very powerful concept.
Absolutely.
Let's see. I also really, really appreciated I guess we could call it the second half of the chapter, where he talked about factory as a service, essentially, or factory being a way to work with integrating bounded context. Even though he did what I absolutely hate and jump around and say, hey, we're going to talk about this. We're actually going to talk about this later, but let me tell you about it right now, just in case. But I did think that was really a powerful concept to think about, is having that. I think he called it I can go find it really quickly, but some sort of service that was dealing with taking certain identities and turning them into context specific items like or objects such as a author or a moderator or something from a different context. So he was showing that a factory is something that's powerful that can help you to span cross bounded contexts in certain situations, and I thought that was kind of cool to think about. I hadn't really, I guess I had never really considered those to be factories, but I can totally see what he's saying from that.
Yeah, I think I highlighted the quote. I think that pretty much describes exactly what you're saying. I think he wrote exactly, the sample-bounded contexts do in some cases require complex construction. These situations occur when integrating bounded contexts. At those times, services function as factories, producing aggregates of value objects of various types. Which I think is pretty much, yeah. And I think you're quite right. That's a very interesting concept as well.
Um, this is kind of a problem with having such a short chapter. I think we're done about 10 minutes in. All right, thanks for coming, everyone. I'm just kidding. Well, I mean, we could be, I guess, but
I like how it has some of the factories at the infrastructure layer. Specifically the one that you were just talking about, that it doesn't even necessarily have to be inside the core domain or the inside the bounded context like domain stuff, but it can be the implementation like technical layer stuff that can live elsewhere.
yeah, and I think that is something that was kind of foreign to me too. I always think of them as being part of the domain. So yeah, I do think that's. I mean, I think it's a good tool to have to just think about. I don't know. I kind of to me it seems like that's bordering on a bad idea. Like to me, I think that would be kind of confusing to to run across it in code if I didn't really understand. But
Yeah.
I mean, I can see it being useful depending on what you're doing.
It almost becomes a naming thing as much as anything, doesn't it? It's like, you can have an object which is at this point in your architecture at the boundary, and then just because of the naming, it's a service. But then if you have the same object within the domain, you call it a factory almost in a way. It becomes. I mean, I know there's more to it than that, but it almost becomes a semantic thing in that sense.
Yeah, I could agree with that.
Yeah, especially if it's like I think you mentioned in there somewhere that he's talking specifically about, or some of the examples were specifically at the anti-corruption layer, which sort of has to happen on boundaries. So you can't really have two bounded contexts talking directly about knowing about each other and talking to each
Right.
other directly. So
Yeah, I think So I'm looking at what you're talking about, and that was when he was talking about the implementation of that service what I was talking about earlier. Yeah, so I agree with that. I think it does make sense having been highlighted, and thanks for pointing that out again because I probably glossed over that in our initial reading. But yeah, I think it does make sense for something like that where it is, like you're saying, like it can't know internally what the other bounded contexts are doing or how to interact with them, that sort of thing. So it does need to happen. It is infrastructural service, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it totally makes sense.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, something I hadn't considered also very much as well was the idea of the abstract factories, that the factory is responsible itself for deciding what kind of object it needs to construct based on the parameters passed in. So I've often thought again of factories, and again this is just my limited thinking of being something concrete that the factory knows it's going to construct one object. And I'm sure I've done cases before where I've returned different objects depending on what the context was. But to have it discussed like this was quite interesting as well.
I agree with that.
Too much agreement tonight.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't
where's
that
the drama?
There's the drama. Yeah. We can't be PHP developers if there's no drama.
They're all on PHP Town Hall tonight.
Probably yes. We can talk about versioning of factories and whether we should skip a version of a factory. Just kidding. Don't start that. I don't know. That's pretty much all the cool things I took out of this chapter. Like I
Do we want to talk about some practical stuff?
Sure, let's go for it. What do you got?
Um, so I've been looking a lot at the basically static factory methods on classes as far as like PHP is concerned,
Hmm.
giving them descriptive names, and I think that they're pretty much just factories. Like if you have a static method that creates a value object in a certain state, I mean it's still a factory, right?
Yeah,
Just yeah.
I would say so.
So I've actually found myself scaling back from creating actual factories to, especially for like value objects and even in certain cases entities, and using static methods to create them instead of creating a factory to do that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of. I think that's what I was, I guess, extrapolating from the talk in this chapter about factory methods, and the idea behind it is being useful because you are able to then capture a lot of stuff that you wouldn't otherwise be able to capture in terms of the language of or the ubiquitous language and such. I think the example that he had in the chapter relating to that was on the calendars, or just I think it was the calendar entry discussion, and it was something like you don't, or the concept of having or creating a new calendar entry wasn't really how it was expressed in the domain. Rather, it was, I forget the specific example, but basically saying that the language that's expressed in your code in terms of using an operator to create a new object as opposed to having all of that captured internally inside of a method that's named in a way that makes sense is much more powerful and useful to understanding the domain as a developer. So naturally, the model fits better, I think. So
Mm-hmm.
It seems that we potentially run the risk there, though, that we can end up with models with tens or hundreds of methods. Now, semantically, it's modeled correctly. I mean, I guess it's everything in moderation, right? But I mean, it's maybe something to keep an eye open for. At what point do you say, well, I've got so many methods on this calendar model. Where do I need to start breaking things apart, just in terms of maintainability, if nothing else?
yeah, I I mean I could kind of see that. I think that would really depend on obviously I think that would depend on the domain and like how much actually
Yeah.
is related to that particular thing. Like in this case, you're talking about creating calendar entries from a uh, calendar aggregate, I think, and so it's like there's only so many things that a calendar aggregate could actually do in terms of factory methods. Like there's only so many. Like you're not going to just shove everything related to scheduled things inside that particular aggregate, right? Like I think that's where the model comes down is really understanding how those are broken up into the various components, like uh, I don't know, like dates and such, like how all of those pieces of data are kind of fit into the puzzle. I think that's the job. Like that's what modeling is all about, right? To
Yeah.
me, anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing that I found interesting was he was talking about all these methods that he has, and he's like, "Look, there's 9 required, or there's 11 required parameters, but we only have to pass in 9 now. Such a big win." I'm like, "What? Why do you have 11 parameters? What's going on here?" But yeah, so I think that's I don't know. I think that's another one of those things where it's like having factory methods often leads to long parameter lists. Like I've always seen that, and the reason is because the symptom you're treating is very very large components of your application are require interaction with a whole bunch of other things. So you abstract that away into a factory. So I don't really see it being to me anyway, to having a really big or a problem with having several different factory methods. I'll say several being a way to dodge the question of how many is too many or whatever. But having several different factory methods, I think, is okay as long as there are several domain concepts being expressed. Like if they're all kind of doing the same thing or just related to build me a person or build me a this or whatever, I think that's a problem. But if there's actually a domain concept of saying assign a new moderator or whatever to this discussion, then I think that is okay to have many of those, or as many as are necessary for the model.
So here's a question, and I think I have some ideas on this. I mean, well, I definitely have some ideas on this, but I want to throw this out for discussion to see what people think. So, particularly in languages like Java, where you can have full method overloading, you can declare multiple constructors. When is it appropriate to use a factory to create an object as opposed to just simple constructor overloading? Can anyone think of any guidelines? I'm curious if we can think of any specific guidelines.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Um, to me personally, like or having multiple constructors, like having many different constructors, to me is a technical solution, I think, to the problem that you're trying to solve, and that's that there are many different ways that a particular object is used within your system. So I think from a DDD standpoint, or from a design standpoint anyway, I would probably favor having factory methods over using a tool like being able to overload a constructor, because it doesn't really express anything in terms of what that domain is solving. It only expresses, hey, you can make this thing 15 different ways. It doesn't say there are 15 different situations that cause this to be created in some certain state. Like that, to
Yeah,
me, it seems like that would be the way I would look at it.
I strongly agree with you on that because it feels to me like if you've modeled something in the domain correctly, by the time you've got to that point, it's almost as if the constructor there should just be one way of doing something, or a limited number of ways in which you're expressing in factors. But to actually create a thing, a calendar event, for example, you can encapsulate the amount of information you need with that. And if you need 5 different constructors, it seems almost that you haven't thought through the actual event model itself enough.
Yeah. Like to me, it just seems like you're kind of throwing flexibility out there just for, it's kind of like the idea of, over abstracting, or over engineering things just because, maybe someday I want to use this in this way. It's like, does the domain that you're working on support the use case or not? Like, that's the decision you have to make. So at that point, why have multiple constructors when one suffices, and there's different factory methods which express that concept of here's how you get to a particular state,
Sure.
or whatever. That's my opinion. Anyone else want to weigh in? No.
We've agreed again. This isn't conducive to a good debate, is it?
Well, he did highlight that there were some performance overhead, so there's some weight to the number of factories that you would want to make, right? So you'd want to decide based on how important their contribution was, how much how verby they were, maybe.
Yeah, no, I got you. So that is definitely a good point, and something I glossed over for sure. But he was talking about how if you have to always use a method on a calendar to create a calendar entry, then you've got the burden of always having to have a calendar in order to create a calendar entry. So you do always have that potential for, or you always have the potential for performance issues depending on how things are set up, obviously. But I think, to me, I would say, or for me anyway, I would favor expressive over performance until performance is a problem. So like I would favor a factory method in that case until I knew for a fact that it's detrimental. Like I would want to have the expressiveness as opposed to saying, well, I can create calendar entries over here and just pass in an ID or a reference or something to the calendar that they belong to, and then I also have to figure out, okay, well, I also have to pass in tenant IDs or whatever. I would favor avoiding that particular problem, avoiding having to pass that data around. But yeah, it's definitely something to concern or something to think about, and also, yes, obviously would impact your decision to have a whole bunch of factory methods depending on what you're doing. So, good point. Jeremy, you can't agree with that too.
I'm struggling to find something to disagree with tonight. So.
Well, how you mentioned something about being able to create a factory across bounded contexts.
Mm-hmm.
How could you give an example that would describe that?
Well, okay, so in the book, the example that he gave was kind of talking about something that I think is pretty common, which is you've got a certain bounded context, which is dealing with your identities or your user accounts, we'll call them. But then inside a different context, you'll have a role of some sort. So in a blog context, you might have an author or that sort of thing, and they're all tied to the concept of users theoretically, but they're actually inside the blog or inside the context for the blog. They're not users; they're authors. So that particular factory that you would have, this is the one which Bo was referencing earlier, where the service contract or the interface was actually in the domain, but the implementation was in the infrastructure layer because it's dealing with talking to that identity context to figure out, does this identity reference that I have, does it have access in these groups, or does it belong to these groups, or whatever? Does it exist? And then take that information that's from the identity context and turn it into an author for the blog context. So that was kind of the example that he gave of having a factory, I don't know what to call it, like a service factory, but a factory that is kind of a service which is sitting in a different layer that's dealing with that boundary between the two contexts. Bo, I know you want to answer this one too.
No, I think you did a good job of that. Unless you want me to fight you on it.
No, I mean I don't. I am going to add to my list of to-dos for the next one to come up with things that I know
Are controversial.
I agree with. Yeah. I don't mind looking like an idiot. No big deal. Anybody else?
So the other thing that I think we might have talked about a little bit, you mentioned one example where it went down from 11 to 9 arguments.
Yeah.
But the other side of that was those 2 arguments came from the actual calendar itself, which was a way to protect the user from creating a calendar entry that was invalid, like by passing in the wrong tenant and calendar ID combination. The one question I would have with that is, and I actually ran into this recently, you can do that from the calendar aggregate itself, or the calendar aggregate root. You can add this factory method that protects the calendar entry. But you can't actually protect the calendar entry from being instantiated on its own incorrectly, right? I mean, the factory method makes it easier to do it correctly, but you can't actually protect the user from doing it wrong.
Yeah, I think that's true. You can't if you do have a public constructor or something like that. That's I think he talked about this. Maybe it was in a different example, but he was talking about the idea of essentially validating inside a factory method for, I think it was a discussion in a forum or something like that. And one of the first lines in the method was a guard against the forum being disabled. And then I think he talked about, I don't know if it was the discussion that had a protected constructor or whatever, but there are, I mean, if that is something that you need to do, that would be a way to do it, I think. Having a inaccessible constructor is one way. But if you do have to have the constructor, yeah, I don't think there is a way, because you could validate that a calendar ID is there or whatever, but without talking to without dealing with an actual instance of a calendar, like there's no way for you to validate information or whatever unless you want to spread that logic all throughout your application, which you don't. So there's really not, in my opinion, there's not really a way around that, I don't think.
Okay.
With this, though, isn't it, if you're doing a domain-driven design, calendar entries will only be created within the domain. They are appropriate too. So therefore, your logic for how those calendar entries should live in that domain anyway, which is going to insulate you partly against user error. And then the other thing it seems to me with that is that it's really a question of how you model the domain, or what's appropriate in modeling the domain. Because I can imagine some instances where it might be appropriate to allow a user to create a calendar entry without there being a calendar, and then to assign it to a calendar later, or assign it to multiple calendars. And then other cases where that's not the case at all, where you would only want an event to be created when it can be specifically assigned to a specific calendar at the time it is created.
Mm-hmm.
It's two different ways of modeling, and you would have to handle those differently anyway.
Yeah, and hopefully you would have some insight from your domain experts that are telling you which way, or both. If you're doing both, then you're screwed, in my opinion. But they would hopefully be able to help you figure that out. Yeah.
But even then, I would say that as the events are being created within the domain, you're still maintaining control over how that happens.
Yeah.
It should be possible to avoid those user errors if you've done it correctly, at least in these two cases. And I can certainly see cases where you could have user error, but God,
I think it depends. In this case, isn't the user the developer? I think, but wasn't your question more along the lines of you could, as a developer, instantiate a calendar entry yourself?
Yep. Yeah, that was more along the lines of what I was going for.
Yeah, so you're only protected from yourself in as smart as you are, or as knowledgeable you are as of the implementation or whatever. So yeah, I think I would still say that the only way to really protect that is if a calendar entry can only be created, attached to a calendar or whatever. If that's part of your domain that you're solving, then it should have a private constructor or should not be able to be created in such a way that...
Yeah. There's no way to validate that. I actually ran into this problem last week in that... So one of the things that I asked you at Lone Star PHP was when you would have an entity that was not an aggregate root. Like, under what situations would that happen? And I actually started to run into those finally. And this calendar entry would be a case of that, where the calendar entry is an entity that is not an aggregate root. So, like the questions that Jeremy's asking, like, you're actually talking about, is calendar entry an aggregate root, in which case you can create it independent of a calendar, or does it depend on a calendar? So it would be completely different. Like, you would have a repository and everything if you can create it independent of itself, or independent of a calendar.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I mean, I can still see cases where, for example, calendar entry might be an aggregate root in that it could be assigned multiple people, can be associated with that event.
Mm-hmm.
So again, to me, it's all a question of what is the domain you're expressing and how do you need to model it at the end of the day, because it's kind of an open-ended question. There are too many ifs and buts in a way to say for sure. But I mean, yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. I'm not sure. I don't think that's a good answer to be honest with your question. But,
So the specific example that I had was we had basically something along the lines of a task board, and the task board belonged to a company, and then a task board could have tasks assigned to it.
Okay.
Well, the tasks had to be assigned to some other thing that was related to the company. So I had to pass a company ID and a task board ID to this task, but there was no way from the ID level to make sure that the task was actually, that the task board belonged to the company that I passed to it. Right. So I was trying to figure out how that works, and that's exactly what this example is, where they're passing a tenant and a calendar to the calendar entry. There's no way inside the calendar entry to verify that the tenant ID should belong to, or the calendar that was passed in belongs to that tenant. So it's this exact example. So I wish I'd read this.
Well, hey, it's not very long. You got plenty of time to go back and read it.
Yeah. Well, I've actually read it now, but I wish I'd read it then. I could have figured this out a little better, because this factory method would have been perfect, because I could have had the task board, which already knows its company. I could have put the factory method on the task board to say create a task. Instead, I still had task as its own entity, but not an aggregate root. But I was creating it by hand instead of having the task board create the task. So that would have solved part of my problem, but it still wouldn't have protected me from being able to create a task independent of anything. But
True.
part of the workflow would have been a lot easier because that would be the happy path. So
Which I actually just thought of something really stupid that I just said, and that was the whole bit about, if you had if you had this calendar entry that you would have a private constructor, because you totally can't do that if you've got factory methods.
yeah,
You can't actually do that, so that obviously won't work. So there isn't. I mean, that'd be the only way you could actually protect yourself, I think. But since you can't do that, then obviously that's not a good answer. So
yeah. I couldn't come up with any answer that was satisfactory to me. But at least now I have a tool that I could have used, which is the factory method on the task board, which would have made it a little easier.
yeah, which I think is kind of an interesting. There's also a discussion going on the DDD and PHP mailing list about. Well, it's been going on for a long time about using the final keyword and and different people have different opinions, obviously, but some prevailing opinion is or some opinion is that you should use final on all of your classes, like as a default, essentially saying that it's not like don't make everything open by default. So they're saying like final's what you should do, and then there's an argument, well, you don't always get everything perfect, so why do that in your library that you're exposing? Why should you do that? And I think this kind of echoes that same idea as being presented there, where you're trying to protect yourself essentially from being able to use an implementation of an object in your domain. But I think that's a separate concept from how do you model it correctly in the domain, because it is an entity. It does exist. Whether or not you can instantiate it, I mean, you probably would know working in the domain that you should always go through the mechanisms that are modeled out that make sense. So you'd be using the factory methods as opposed to just instantiating your own calendar entry. But the option is there because of the implementation. It does exist, but you should be disciplined enough not to do it.
I wonder if that also touches on an area we haven't considered, which is one of the main reasons for using factory methods is that it does guard against changes in your domain. I mean, changes occur, changes happen all the time. And if all of your object creation is through factories, you can do whatever you want to those factories as long as the contract remains the same of what you pass in and what you return.
Yeah.
So it's just another way of guarding against implementation changes.
I would say so too.
Where do you
Anything
land
else?
on the final?
What do I what?
Where do you all land on final keyword?
It seems nuts to me. So I would go the other way. That it seems to me that one of the big things about Solid is the open-close principle. That we're closed for modification but open for extension. And if the minute you say final, you're saying, well, this is the only possible way to use this object. I've thought of every possible use case. So I would go the other way. That I typically use final in rare cases rather than a default case. By default, I'm open for extension. Final has to be a special reason for me for wanting to use that. But that's just where I stand from. I'm willing to be persuaded the other way, to the dark side.
Yeah, I'm in essentially the same camp. I think most of the discussion that I've seen is focused around the idea of being a library maintainer of something, such as Doctrine is one of the examples, where you are open for extension, and now you essentially are committing to, within that same version line, I guess, with that same major version line, to always supporting everyone's crazy use case, essentially. Like whatever they've come up with and extended your stuff, you're somehow committing yourself to it. And I can kind of see that being a headache, but at the same time, I definitely agree and follow the same principle that I want most of what I write to be open for modification. In the rare case that I don't, I will prevent you with whatever mechanisms I can. So,
Yeah.
Where do you stand, Bo? Final all the things?
Well, I haven't actually used final on anything, but I'm not opposed to it by any means. I often think about how much time and effort I put into my code to make sure that it's extensible, and then there's never any extension, ever. You
But
know,
that's
and
the thing, though, isn't it? Is that you can't tell what's going to happen in 6 months from now. And you may be right in 99.9% of the cases, it's never going to be extended. But that time when there is that 0.1 case, you'll be happy that you put that extra effort in to make sure that it is extensible.
Yeah, of course, extensible is not only limited to inheritance, right? Like it is. I mean, you can adopt plugin architectures and that sort of thing. Like, depending on what you're needing to do, I can see the argument for why it would make sense. I think there's, you know, for me personally, there's limited use in doing it because I feel like if you really want to extend this and modify it in some way, then go for it, and then personally give myself that option in the future. But I could definitely see an argument for if you spent the time to really think about how you want to enable people to extend or improve upon your what you know what your original model or what your original object does, then I can see that as being a useful tool to use. But as far as defaulting to final and everything, I don't see that being a good piece of advice for 99% of developers out there.
See, I was wondering, so even in the case of a library maintainer, right, the argument is, I'm going to make this method final so that you can't break the library by overriding it in a child class.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to me to be, again, another fallacy, because isn't it your job when you extend that method is to make sure that you honor the contract that's implicit in it. You're accepting the same input, you should be returning the same type of output. So,
Yeah,
if you can't do that when you extend a method, then it's not the library maintainer's fault. It's the developer that's altered it. It's their problem.
I agree with that. Of course, I've also seen, tons of tons
Yeah.
of situations where that doesn't really matter to people. They
Yeah.
don't really see it that way.
So in effect, what we're saying is that we'll declare this final so that we don't have to wade through hundreds of emails and forum messages saying, why doesn't this work when I've changed it in this way?
I think that is part of it.
Yeah,
I,
I can understand that as well. I mean, I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing.
I mean, so the argument is that I've seen that if I make a class final and you need to extend it, and you can prove to me why you need to extend it, which is that extra barrier, it's easy for me to take final off. It's not like final is actually final. It's like if 90% of my code is never going to be extended by anybody else, and if putting final on it makes sure that it's good and solid and no one's ever going to be able to break it, great. And then if you need to extend it, then I can go in and take final off one of the classes. I think a really good case for it.
See, that's easy when you and I are working on the same team, or even if we're separated by half a continent, or I can pick up the phone, I can talk to you, and you go, yeah, I made that change for you, it's committed, it's done. If I'm using a third-party library, then that becomes much harder, simply because I need to persuade the developers, who may be, however many of them across different continents. They're going to be concerned that any change I suggest is going to have an impact. Now, of course, removing final isn't necessarily going to be, a breaking change, but and then you're talking about timelines as well. It becomes increasingly hard.
Mm-hmm. If I saw final, I would see that as a barrier. I wouldn't be as likely to question it. I would consider it already a done deal.
Yeah, and that is a valid point. Like that, I think what you'd see in practice is yes, you can, like after you release something, you can definitely, remove the final keyword, and it wouldn't be as drastic as trying to add a final keyword somewhere. But I think the point would then be most likely the people are going to find a workaround or find a way that they can get whatever they want done, and then they're not going to tell you about it. So you can end up with something that actually needs to be extended or needs to be extensible in some way, not just because everyone has found a way to get around that particular problem. And I think that would be a detriment to your community, but I think that's a risk that any library maintainer would have to weigh.
Yeah. I think that it's just too easy for people to extend a class and not really think about what they're really trying to do. And that's always the argument that I remember seeing from the doctoring community, is that, there's a lot of things that people want to do that they're going to do horribly wrong because they think they can just extend a class versus trying to use one of the better ways to do or to accomplish what they're trying to do.
Mm.
I think that's the biggest reason that I would be okay with it, like working with a library that was like that, is that if they've been thinking about these things and they have ways around them, and they have reasons why you shouldn't try to extend classes, then I don't know, maybe it's okay. I've never personally done it in any of my projects, but I don't think it's a bad thing if someone wants to do it.
There's always tomorrow, Bo. You can go final crazy if you want.
Maybe I'll do that on my next package.
It still seems like to me, it still seems like the wrong approach to the problem. I mean, the problem is that in any walk of life, you can't guard against idiocy in every single form. And then the minute you try to, it's just going to drive yourself nuts. And so, all you can say is, we've done the best we possibly can here. Here's our documentation. Here's what it tells you should and shouldn't do. If you go against the spirit of this, you're on your own. I mean, we can't help you.
Yeah, that's the same answer, I think, to Bo's question about how do you protect people from creating a calendar item by themselves. Like,
Sure.
You can't. If they want to go down that route, then go for it. But recognize that there is a preferred and a recommended, I guess.
We do everything we can to steer them into
strongly
the right
encouraged.
path, but if you've got the one person who wants to strike out and into untrodden territory, off they go.
Yeah.
Are there any performance benefits over using Final?
I do not know. I would be shocked if there are, but I do not know.
I wonder if there would be in a compiled language. I can imagine there might be.
It might be.
No, that's rubbish. Sorry, the compiler would just see the whole source code at the time and then work out from there. Yeah, sorry. That's what happens when you think out loud on air. It never works out well.
You have to watch yourself.
No kidding.
I asked the question.
I fell straight into it.
Yeah.
It was bait. All right, cool. So, any other quasi-DDD related topics? Or general book topics, I guess? It is a book club, right?
Yeah. Well, are you going to have the same length of time to do the 60 or 50 pages for the next chapter?
Generally, I try to. I would like them to be roughly an hour each, but if the discussion goes on longer than an hour, or short an hour, whatever, I'm kind of flexible on.
I mean, is it still going to be 2 weeks to get?
Oh, 2 weeks from now to then. Well, I don't know. What does everyone think?
Sure.
Sure. We've got one vote for sure.
I'll suck it up then.
What can I say?
I'm trying to do too many things.
Welcome to the club. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm not kidding. Welcome to the club.
Yeah. I think we're all doing that. Yeah, I mean, 2 weeks works for me. I definitely can't do it next week, so not 1 week. You're safe on that.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So all right. So I'll plan on 2 weeks. Then, since there are no real.
I'll try to promote it for the right day next time.
Yeah, that would be swell.
Yeah.
I'll try to catch it earlier next time.
If you get some calls tomorrow, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I'm not staying up all night to read another 50 pages. So I have a potentially open-ended question that doesn't necessarily need answering today. If you think about it. I work as part of a very large company with developers across the world, and I'm working on new functionality, but I'm very keen to try and introduce DDD ideas and concepts into that, and there's an existing application that hasn't used it in the past. So I'm curious as to if anyone has any ideas as to how to introduce these ideas and concepts into such a large organization which has particular ways of doing things already, in the way that we can get buy-in from other developers. Yeah, I guess that's kind of my question, I guess.
That's what we're in the thick of right now.
Yeah.
It's been an adventure, but we're taking on several of our legacy apps and trying to make sense out of them, make them actually represent the behavior that they're they're doing, and but we're also at the same time as we've been trying to take on these applications and reform them, we're reforming business practices. So we've just in the past year and a half, I think, taken on GitHub within our organization. We've started using Jira and project management, but the projects themselves, we're taking on, we've kind of modeled where we want to go, and we're using that as a goal and figuring out which parts are achievable to implement now versus which ones we need to put off, and just know that this is our end goal, where what we're shooting for, and just keep working, keep pulling out the old stuff that doesn't work as well and put in the new. And it's going to be a long run, not a sprint.
Cool.
Yeah, we're kind of done something similar. We're not really a large organization, so can't really help you on that front. But in terms of getting the business, I guess, or getting people to understand and buy into the concept, I think a cool exercise would be to get stakeholders or get somebody in a room and try to draw the idea of a context map for the existing stuff, like kind of just draw, what does it do, and just kind of start categorizing from that front. And you could even start by drawing just a big circle that's kind of colored in and be like, this is what it is right now, like this is how this system is designed right now, and then explain the benefits. And then for us, what we've done is kind of tackle, on a project by project case, we start thinking about, okay, for this particular project, what contexts are involved, and start from there and start the modeling from that point. So we're kind of slowly being able to separate things into their own subcontexts and whatnot, and bounded contexts, and deal in that way. We're able to actually take a very large ball of mud, essentially, and let it sit there, and then extract out concepts essentially into context. So
Okay.
that's what we've done. And like Emily was saying, it's a long process, you're not going to win people over immediately.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, so the company I work in it's a massive application, and it does many, many different things. So it tends to be that certain teams own certain areas of the application.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm working in is new functionality. So in a way, that's an advantage, is that we can potentially turn around to the rest of the company and say, we've implemented this way. If you want to talk to us, you need to, here's what you need to do. And it's also a bad thing that everybody is siloed, into their own areas. It can create problems as well. It'll be interesting. I'm quite keen to try and explore in the next quarter how we can start to introduce some of these ideas and start to leverage some of this stuff.
Is it new features, or is it like brand new functionality? Like, can it be its own bounded context?
Both.
Both?
Yeah. Yeah. I can't. Unfortunately, I can't go into too many specifics.
No, that's fine. But I mean, if you can build your own, I mean, that's kind of what a lot of the whiteboarding is about. Is if you can create your own bounded contexts.
Yeah.
You can do whatever you want to inside of them as long as you interface with somebody else, and kind of just lead the way by doing your own.
Exactly. So we effectively say, here's what we've developed. It's new functionality. If you want to talk to us, if you need to tell us things that are happening elsewhere in the application, here's how you do it. It's and for example, an interesting thing that it's a very large code base, but there's going to be a large push to moving towards using business events, and that's going to play into that side of it as well. That we can create listeners in the boundaries of our context that can listen to events from elsewhere in the application. And it's basically another adapter into our domains, basically. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting problem. I'm quite keen to see how this pans out.
Yeah, it would be kind of cool along the same lines to figure out if you could kind of align all of the siloed teams with their own context or their own bounded context, and they kind of treat it like that, and then you're modeling out the new stuff in a DDD fashion. Like you're applying DDD to your newer stuff that you're working on, and I think eventually that would spill over, and everyone else would be like, well, hey, how are you? How are you doing this so well, or whatever? How are you able to get this? And you're like, oh, well, that's easy. I do this, and then that would infect, I think, everyone else and get them thinking about their specific context. And then if you're already aligned in ways that make sense for the overall map of context, then I think that would be an easy way to tackle it, or at least a fun way to tackle it.
Yeah, and that's exactly the approach that we've discussed in the office that I work in. Funny enough, but we'll be able to hopefully get buy-in from our team. We're still forming our team, so if we decide to go this approach, and if one or two other teams in the company adopt the same approach, we can show some benefits within the next 6 to 12 months, then we've already sort of halfway to winning the battle in the way.
Yeah.
I think that's where you'll see the most improvement if you can show some success,
Yes.
show how easy it is to read a well-described model, and then show the benefits of how you can interact, then other organizations can start to embrace it.
Yeah.
That's been our experience, other parts of our group.
Great. Well, thank you. That definitely helps.
It's very similar advice to the idea of you want to get people fired up about testing, so you test all of your stuff, and then you go home at 5 o'clock every day or whatever, and then they're like, how are you able to go out for beers or whatever, and we're stuck here trying to debug this issue that we've been working on all day? And you're like, well, I've got these tests that help me figure out where the problem is, so it takes me half the time that it takes you to figure things out. Like, oh, so let me get on that. So I think it's kind of a similar pattern of you've got something that's very helpful in terms of understanding your particular context, so naturally people should want to do it, and if they don't have to. Luckily, they're in their own context, and you just have an anti-corruption layer in between yourselves, right? And then you're good.
Yeah.
Well, cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for participating. We will be back in 2 weeks to talk about repositories in depth. Bo said he's going to have 100 questions, so that's good. I'll try to come up with some controversial material between now and then.
If we share our 100 questions with each other, we can all have contrary answers.
There you go. All right. Thanks. Y'all have a good night.
Thanks. You too.